Well, hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me today as we continue talking about the Protestant Reformation. This is video number 2 in a 6-video series on the Protestant Reformation. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at what we mean by Reformation and what were some of the causes behind the Protestant Reformation happening the way it did and when it did in Europe. In the first video, we talked a little bit about the origins of Christianity and how that ultimately led to the Roman Catholic Church being the Christian church in Europe, not only during part of the time that the Roman Empire was around, but also for many centuries after the Roman Empire had fizzled out. And so as far as talking about the Protestant Reformation in Europe, the time period that we're going to be getting to as we speak to the beginnings of this would be the early part of the 1500s. But before we get into more of those details, I want to just touch on some of the basics of what we even mean by Reformation and what the causes were of this reform movement. So first of all, I just want to speak to the word itself. Reformation, if you don't really have any context, kind of has a fancy sound to it, or at least I've always thought it kind of had a fancy sound to it. But really, it's just a word referring to reform. If you look at the word Reformation itself, you can see the word reform within it. And so it's just a term that speaks to a movement for reform. And in this case, it's a religious movement, so a movement for religious reform. And then most specifically, we're talking about Christianity. So the Protestant Reformation simply is a reference to a Christian reform movement that took place in Europe beginning in the early 1500s. Now, when talking about why this happened, there's some big picture, or there's a big picture way that you can take a look at it, and then you can also break it down into a lot of details. For a movement like this to take place, it wasn't like there was just going to be one thing or one perspective that shook things the way this did. But to speak to kind of both angles, first want to just address kind of the big picture approach for why the Protestant Reformation happened. And in many ways, it really came down to the dominance of the Catholic Church in Europe. And again, with the term Catholic, that just means universal. So this was the Christian church that was present throughout Europe. And the time we're going to be talking about gets into the 1500s. Now, with some of these slides and pictures that I show you, I try to be somewhat symbolic, I guess you could say. And so what hopefully you can see in this picture here is that the Catholic Church was a much bigger force than the European people were. And so part of the reason why there was a desire to bring some changes to the church is that Europeans ended up finding some things that they didn't quite like about it. And then especially when it was such a powerful force in their life, because it didn't really matter if you were a truly spiritual and faithful person or not, it was a big deal in your life in some way or another. And so especially as people began to identify some things they didn't think were quite right or weren't going well or just flat despised, it was pretty easy in one way or another for people to grow resentful of the church and desire for something to change. So big picture wise, the Catholic Church was a very powerful force in people's lives. And so that's a big picture factor of what was going on. Now, I'm not showing this video as a part of my video, but a video that is very good from the Crash Course series is a video on the Protestant Reformation. Would definitely encourage anybody who's viewing this video and spending time with this information and this content right now to definitely view that video on your own time at some point. Now, the other part of what I want to address in today's video is just to run through some of the more detailed causes. And I've broken this down into 4 different categories. So we'll take a look at those one at a time. Now, with a Christian religious reform movement, as took place in Europe, there were definitely religious causes or religious reasons why people wanted to bring about reform. And part of that stemmed from the fact that as time was going by, religious leaders, people like priests, people like cardinals, people like bishops, were beginning to conduct themselves in what you might think of as less religious ways, and were becoming more worldly. And that was something that was at least in part a product of the Renaissance era that was taking shape. The time period when the Protestant Reformation took place was a time when many people were becoming less clearly spiritual in how they conducted themselves day to day, and that filtered over into the church itself. Now, another issue, and I'll address this in more detail in a later video, was the sale of indulgences. If there was maybe a hot button focal point that really kicked off the Protestant Reformation, it was a practice that the church was engaged in, where in some cases church officials were selling what was called an indulgence to people to try to raise money for the church. And when people bought it, they were given the impression that buying this indulgence, contributing this money, would help them to achieve salvation. And there were some people that would really take issue. Martin Luther in particular would really take issue with the idea that the church was leading people to believe that they could, in effect, buy their salvation. So there were definitely religious factors behind the Protestant Reformation. And again, I'll speak more about this idea of indulgence selling in a later video. A second category where there were some factors behind this Reformation movement were social factors. I kind of alluded to this in the last section. Humanism and the secularism of the Renaissance caused some people to question how and why things were being done the way they were being done. And it didn't mean that people no longer had faith or were no longer willing to believe in the church, but in all the years before the Renaissance, nobody would have thought to question the church and what the church was doing, or why it believed what it believed, or why it told people to do what they told people to do. But people are now starting to ask questions. And that was new and that was different. It might seem normal from our perspective today in the world we live in to question the church or question matters of faith. But that was kind of a new thing. And then another big social factor, and I don't believe that the Protestant Reformation would have happened when it did, was the creation of the printing press. By the time the Protestant Reformation got started, the printing press had been around for over half of a century. So it was commonplace to have the ability to print and circulate materials pretty fast. A big part of why the Reformation happened is, as some challenging ideas got out there, a lot of people were exposed to them. What would have maybe just affected a very small community a century before now could affect a much wider area. So social factors were very significant with the Protestant Reformation happening, how it did, and especially when it did. Now, a third area that was important, I would categorize as political factors. One thing about the church is it was the dominant force in people's lives. The church was hierarchical, so they had different levels of people and different power that those people had. Priests were more your local level contacts, but moving on up, you had bishops, you had cardinals, and then ultimately you had the Pope at the top, who was the head of the church. And really, with the church being the dominant force in people's lives in Europe, the Pope was, in some respects, the leader of all of Europe. Now, at the local levels for political leaders, if you look at people like kings, one thing a lot of kings desired to have was power and authority, and many of them simply resented the idea that there was some other leader that had power over them, and so there was just a little bit of conflict there. And if there was any possible way that a king could somehow gain more power, either more power than the church or just more power generally, a lot of them were interested in that, and so a lot of political leaders or secular leaders began to see the Pope being like some kind of a foreign ruler that was trying to have authority over them that they shouldn't be able to have. So there was definitely openness among political leaders to have something change so that they could have more power for themselves. And then a fourth category that was impactful is what I'd call economic factors behind the Protestant Reformation. One thing that was expected of people throughout Europe, whether you were talking about just regular everyday people or kings, was tithing or contributing money to the church. A lot of people resented being required to do this. In some respects, the tithing expectation for people in Europe prior to the Protestant Reformation was not altogether different than the way we are expected to pay taxes to our government today. And though we understand it's a legal obligation, doesn't mean we like it. And I think you can recognize that if you're frustrated with your government, or don't think the government's using the money well, it can be especially frustrating knowing that you're giving money that you earn to this entity that you don't feel very good about. And so people felt that way about the church. So paying taxes or giving money to the church felt bad for a lot of people. And if there was something that could change that obligation, people were interested in that. And so overall, when you look through the different factors, you can see a big part of the reason why we're now talking about this reform movement, this Protestant Reformation, where the Christian church was reformed and changed in Europe at this time, didn't stem from just one issue, but there were a lot of different issues. And when you put them all together, it becomes much less surprising that a big movement for reform would take place. In the next video, we're going to get more specifically into the person who really got this all started and what that person's ideas were. So in our next video, we're going to take a closer look at Martin Luther, a very important figure with the Protestant Reformation. Thanks.